And we're back on What the Funk. I took probably about a month away from podcasting, which was kind of nice. I do have a day job that pays me money, so sometimes I should focus on that instead of just putting out podcasts. But I love it, and I'm personally really excited about this one for a few reasons. New client of Funk Futures. I put out a press release recently about this. Data²'s. That's Data2.ai. We've got Matt Kilker and Jon Brewton, two of the leaders over at the organization Data²'s. But also, you guys are doing AI in oil and gas, obviously, Data².ai. But AI is a hot topic right now. I don't think anybody really knows what they're doing in the oil and gas space as it relates to AI, but you guys have a lot of ideas. Got some military backgrounds, some oil and gas backgrounds, working with some government entities, working with oil and gas operators, sports fans, located all over the place. Really kind of cutting edge, I think, for what's happening in oil and gas, and personally really excited to see where things go with Data²'s. So this is a little bit different. Typically, it's only one person and me. I've got a couple dudes on today. So we'll start with you, Matt, and then we'll go to you, Jon. And I'm going to put you right on the spot. Who is Matt Kilker?
Oh, good question. Inquiring minds want to know, right? So thanks for having us. Appreciate it. I serve Jon as the Chief Revenue Officer for Data²'s. Focused primarily on the energy sector. We've got a lot of fantastic people that Jon will tell you about that's on the government side of our business that we're kicking off. But I'm a native to Colorado.
Nice.
Grew up on the Front Range. Yeah, that's something we haven't really chatted about yet.
Whereabouts? Where'd you grow up?
Grew up in Brighton, the thriving metropolis. So enjoyed our time there. Stepped out and went to college in Oklahoma State. Got a degree in biosystems and agricultural engineering. Really thought my path was going to lead me towards designing tractors and doing cool stuff in agriculture. And somehow, some way, I ended up in oil and gas in the OFS space as a design engineer for Baker Hughes. And just like all of us in oil and gas, we took our promotions and travels around the country, in and out of Houston and Oklahoma and back and forth to Colorado a few times. And now we're in the DFW area, just outside of Fort Worth. Wife and 3 daughters, enjoying them go crazy and trying to keep sanity. After I stepped away from the OFS space about 5 years ago, I spent the biggest focus of my time on the water management space and the midstream space with a few operators, and excited to see how we can make digital revolutions come to life here.
Nice. So you grew up in Brighton, which is just east of here. I'm in Lafayette, close by. Why'd you decide to go to Oklahoma State? Was it the agriculture school that you wanted to get your education in, or what drove you to the Sooner State?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was, frankly, a really good engineering school. Appreciated the program that they had put together. I had no idea what agricultural engineering was when I started there. Was focused on mechanical. Enjoyed the space that we got there. But if you would have asked me in high school, are you going to head to Oklahoma State? It probably wasn't in the cards. And like most gentlemen, I followed my bride down there. It was her idea to step down, and it was a great place for us to go start our life together.
Nice. And so how did you meet the Data²'s team?
Reached out to Jon on a LinkedIn post where we started talking about his business development needs and fit the bill from a project perspective that I think is a niche that we'll probably get into a little bit in the water management space, and just have had a fantastic time here. It's a great individual and a great team to work with.
Oh, that's cool. So for everybody listening, you can get jobs on LinkedIn just by reaching out to people directly. Probably not by applying, but just reaching out directly. We'll get back to more with you, Matt. Now, Mr. Brewton, who is Jon Brewton?
This is an easy question. I'm a non-complex person. Jon Brewton, CEO, founder of Data²'s, but life began for me in Pasadena, Texas, just south of Houston. born and raised Houston native. Go Stros, go Rockets. I think my journey into the stuff that we're going to talk about today is a bit of a winding path, and it started with the military. I was an enlisted airman in the U.S. Air Force, served kind of here in the States and also overseas. But I started my career in the military as an honor guardsman, which is a very niche job that doesn't have a lot of utility outside of the military, but a very cool job to have while you're in the military. A couple of years in, I was like, man, I need to go back to school. I didn't finish college before I joined the military. Officers were living great lives, and I thought, man, that looks good. So I'm going to go back to school. So I got out of the military under a Palace Chase agreement, which essentially allows you to get out of active duty, transfer to the reserves while you go back to university. And that's what I did. The intent was for me to go back into the military as an officer. And when I transitioned out of active duty, I transitioned into the petroleum, oils, and lubricants job for the U.S. Air Force. Small scale refining operations, liquid nitrogen production, JP8 management, working with local refineries and different things in the places that you're at. And that really led me to oil and gas, a bit of a winding road to get there. I did have some family that was in oil and gas, but for the most part, nobody really had a deep root in the industry or in any companies. Went to a hiring fair with somebody, and oddly enough, I went just with my buddy to this hiring fair. BP was hiring. Put my name in the hat. 8 months later, I was an employee at BP, training to be a field engineer and basically a company man on rigs. So that's how I got my start. A couple of years after that, I transitioned over to Chevron. We had a shared training center, Chevron and BP did. It was the Drilling Training Alliance, which was a great little place in Houston. And I would always show up there, and all the BP folks were looking like they weren't having a great time, and all the Chevron folks looked like they were having a really good time. And the demographics of the companies were wildly different. Chevron was really, really young at the time. And so it seemed like a really good fit. And so I ended up applying, going over to Chevron, worked in a myriad of capacities there and a number of places. Started in California, transitioned to the global group. During my time in the global group, I worked in Scotland, Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, the UK. Then I moved to Thailand, lived in Angola for several years, then transitioned back to the States. And it was really at that point, I'd sort of worked in every facet of upstream and sort of midstream by this time. And this is 15 years in. At Chevron, the majority of my career there was basically like a mercenary. I'd show up, try to figure out what was going on, problem solve in places. And most of it was through the implementation and use of like new technologies and solutions as a byproduct of that. I spent the last decade of my time at Chevron really paying attention to what was happening in the market, what were the cool tools, things coming out, and how we could use them to improve our operations, improve our predictability, recover more costs, reduce our costs and recover more revenue. And so the byproduct of that, I ended up going to school again at Harvard, joint program through the Paulson School of Engineering and the Harvard Business School. Spent 18 months there. Made some good friends, ended up moving to Australia, running a portion of a company over there that was a advanced analytics, machine learning, AI solutions development firm called Quantium. And after about 6 months working over there, I thought, I don't know why I'm doing this for somebody else. I need to start my own company. And so that's really how we got Data²'s, but Houston native, big sports fan, oil and gas lifer for the most part, and really, really focused on how we can use some of the new things that are coming to market to change how we operate, and really our efficiency curves, just as an industry, I think are going to be affected in a really positive way as we start to roll down this path.
Yeah, I appreciate the answers from both of you guys, and I would just comment on AI in oil and gas, which I want to dive pretty deep into here. I see a lot of AI companies that, of course, want to get into oil and gas, but might not have the subject matter expertise, which, as we all know, is a non-starter. And then I think there are oil and gas companies themselves who may not have the internal technological horsepower to implement AI in a way that they want. So talk a little bit about the thesis behind Data²'s. When did you guys start the company? Where are you effectively all based? And what are you guys doing? Like, AI is so ubiquitous and generic. Like, let's talk a little bit more specifics. What are the use cases that oil and gas companies will apply for artificial intelligence in their business?
Cool. Well, I'll pick up at least the front end of that. We started Data² in, let's say, July of 23. That was essentially the first time the founder cohort came together and said, all right, there's a lot of new stuff. We've been talking about things. We all met up in Vegas, which was great. Sat in a room in the Mirage and said, all right, let's chart out our future. Are we going to build a company? Are we going to be consultants? Are we going to build products? What do solutions look like? How are we going to impact the market? And it really settled on sort of like three key themes. Out of the founder group, we either served in the military, were oil and gas lifers in some capacity, or both, or studied together. And so really tight-knit group, but we had a couple of key vertical markets that we understood really, really well and we could apply our subject matter expertise to. And so we really centered on, all right, let's really focus on using our experience, our understanding of these tools and how they can impact these sectors, and try to develop some initial product solution-facing approach. What are our use cases? Try to define these things. And through that, we essentially got to the point where we were targeting high reliability industries. It really boils down to like energy, defense, finance, healthcare. We don't know much at all about healthcare, so that's sort of a thing that's sitting off to the side at the moment, although there's deep applicability in that space. And so we really wanted to focus on energy and defense as our primary approaches and our understandings of these places. And some low-hanging fruit at the time that we got started was abandonments. And so one of the cool things about generative AI is you can give it sort of two versions of something, and you can say, hey, like, what are the differences? What are the similarities? Which one comes before? If there's, temporal elements defined in these documents, like, start dates and end dates and wheres and whos. As a byproduct of that, we said, all right, let's see what we can do with abandonments, because that's a really complicated problem to solve from an oil and gas engineering perspective. Sure. I was an abandonment SME and wrote all kinds of standards for Chevron, especially in the Asia South business unit, around how we do that work. It's a complicated workflow because you really have to reconcile asset histories over a really lengthy period of time in most instances, especially if we're dealing with mid-continent North American assets that have been around for nearly 100 years. And there was this light bulb moment where we fed it a bunch of information, and it was handwritten documents that we had scanned. It was old scanned typed reports, new electronic form documentation. And we started to really use this to reconcile not only sort of the asset history, but like, what is the current state of this, target asset? Like, what's in the hole? What problems does it have? Where is it right now? And we found pretty quickly that we were able to do that, and do that with a high degree of efficacy. But this is a really funny thing. It's like, a really good outcome, but completely unintended consequence. Because of the problem that we tried to solve, it's really differentiated from both a data perspective and just sort of a historical perspective. You have structured data, semi-structured data, unstructured data in the form of documentation, and in some instances, high frequency data that you can leverage to make an informed decision about, what that asset is at that time. And because of that, we essentially set up a system where we have to cross-reference every single thing that we see to determine what is the current state of something. As a byproduct of that, we sort of got into this testing protocol that we wrote when we were developing our platform that allows us to essentially determine the connections of any piece of information on any element. So we can define the who's, the what's, the when's, the where's, and as a byproduct of that, we can define, essentially what's happened. And how it happened. And that was a really interesting point, because what that all does when you put it together is it creates explainability. And this is something the industry struggles with in an exhaustive capacity right now, because there are no commercially available platforms and generative AI tools that produce fully explainable, transparent, and trusted results. There's just a fact. And we kind of stumbled on a way to make that happen. And it's hyper repeatable, and it doesn't matter what we pointed at. It doesn't matter what data we use. It doesn't matter what LLMs we use. We figured out a way to make that happen. And it's sort of through taking an engineering approach to problem solving that we manufactured this outcome. And it really was like the old pin board with yarn, tying all these things together and saying, how do these things work? But in a really smart and efficient way. And that really set us on the path that we're on right now, which is high reliability industries, focusing on high efficacy rate decision making, suggestions, interrogation, investigation that creates really, really effective outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. I'll leave Matt jump in. Feel free to add any context you'd like from your side.
Dumb it down for us, Matt.
Yeah. So John's brilliant and gets on tangents that we have to be time out a second. But appreciate all of it. I learn something every time. I think, so I want to look at a perspective from the user. If I'm acquiring a business, if I'm trying to look through a data set that may be disparaged, every oil and gas company out there has records that aren't seamless, that we've stored in flat file systems, we've stored in boxes, we've got Excel spreadsheets everywhere. As a good engineer, we should have Excel spreadsheets in every folder of our domain. And so when we start to think through how do we operationalize that data set, it becomes overwhelming at times. So the advantage that I see that we're trying to do different is trying to create those connections between not just the data set itself, but the data itself. So each individual attribute that we have within that data set is meaningful, and it takes countless years and hours of very skilled individuals trying to decipher that and create connections between those data sets that can either optimize a system, that can produce predictive results going forward, can create plans and scenario models that if we just allow it to sit in that flat file, it becomes very cumbersome to try to get through. The tool that we've developed has the ability to decipher all of that and create those connections between data sets and allow us to have tangible results in very complex scenarios with disparate data sources.
I like that. And now talk to me a little bit about how you interact with the data. So obviously there's this component of you've got Excel spreadsheets and you have, public data sets available through state agencies or some of the big, subscriptions that companies have. You have internal data sets. You've got messy data, some that needs to be OCR'd sitting in boxes. Okay, so you work your magic and you go through a process that figures out this data and places it in boxes and allows it to interact together. How then does the human interact with that data? Is this through like asking questions of it through a chat bot? Like what does the workflow look like then on a daily basis for the ops engineer or production lead that wants to ask questions of the data?
This is a good tandem question because I'll address it from a data model perspective, and then Matt can talk about exactly how we interact from a user perspective. From a data modeling perspective, we're not using say SQL databases or traditional relational databases because they lack a level of fidelity that you need for these systems to work really, really well. There's a couple of concepts that you'll hear in the market from AI systems, generative AI systems, like retrieval augmented generation, which is effectively a way to convert words and proximity to numbers and then correlate these things and then use that to find the shortest path between two things, essentially similarity tool. So you can say like these things are grouped together and they're related to one another as a byproduct of that. That can only get you so far. And it's where a lot of the systems that are commercially available today start to fall down. They start to really perform poorly in a couple of different ways because of the structure of how they work. They're all statistical in nature. We don't need to get into the math behind that. But at the end of the day, you're taking guesses that are based on probabilities that are associated to numbers that are derived to proximity. And it's this complicated chain of logic that gets applied when you do hit ChatGPT or any other large language model and ask a question. What we found out pretty early is that if we use knowledge graph data models, we were able to almost pave a road for that reasoning because they're tangible in nature. You can see how one element of the data model is connected to another element. You can actually see the strength of that connection. And as a byproduct of that, it's in research now, it's like really prevalent. People are talking about graph retrieval augmented generation because it gives you a step change in effectiveness. You go from what would be effectively a 30% efficacy rate on returns for traditional RAG methods to roughly 60%. The key differentiator for us is that once we figured this out about a year ago, is we also started just doing testing to figure out how we could make that model more robust. And it's kind of through this that we define this workflow where we both sort of test all of this information and then enrich this information in a multitude of ways. And so what our graph RAG solution looks like, and that's being sort of very polite to our solution and not giving it the right amount of deference, is think Barry Bonds, 73 homer season, like all juiced up on growth hormone and steroids. And like, that's what we're building from a data model perspective. Like, this thing is exceptionally robust, hyper contextualized, semantically embedded at multiple levels with metadata tags that allow you to parse out every single element within the data model. And as a byproduct of that, we can create full transparency and clarity about how information is being leveraged by a model. We can ground the model to the fact base that we give it. And as a byproduct of that, the efficacy rates of what we deploy from our review platform are exceptionally high. And so that allows you to interface with these models in a couple of really unique ways. One is through natural language, and then one is through user inspection sort of the graph database model itself. There's going to be like 0.7% of people in the world that are going to look at the graph and be like, I really want to dig into this. And then everybody else is going to be like, let's just use words because that makes a lot more sense.
Right.
So that's kind of, I'll hand it over to Matt to kind of give his perspective on this. And we can use some of the stuff that we're doing with one of our clients right now, just in concept, to kind of drive it home on the water solution water management solution that we're putting together for produced water management. But I'll turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, thanks, John. So how we interact with it, John's absolutely right in the fact that manipulating and interrogating the graph itself isn't what majority of the users will see. It's the back end that's behind there.
Sure.
The web interface or the local machine interface is fully customizable for the application that we're working through, right? So if we're building an advisor that's working through a water management scenario, we still need to display all of the relevant data that operations engineer, the drilling engineer, whomever's interfacing with that data set needs to see. We've done some really cool things contextually that it is a byproduct of us organizing the data. Even though it's disparaged in the back end, we can map to it and bring all of that to the forefront interface. So when it's sitting apparent, filterable, just like a normal data set would be, it's interesting. As an engineer, for face value, it's interesting. We can then step into those data sets and use AI to interrogate those individual data sets and create summaries around the data that becomes really interesting. If I'm simply preparing for a workover for that day, I can key that one well up and I get the full history of that well in natural language. And instead of sitting and trying to decipher tables and rows and how my data is related to each other, I get a context that's in natural language back to us. Secondarily, because of that organization and that underlining feature of the graph organization, we can use the language models to be able to interrogate it in your similar ChatGPT scenario and ask it really intelligent questions on how do we want to structure our day? How do we want to organize a plug and abandonment for a specific well? We've got a multitude of data sets that we can simply query and use it as a thought partner to help create value for that proposition.
Yeah. Right. One last thing I'd just add to that is it's super easy from a user interface perspective to speak in your own words, your own language. The way that you query a system sort of very naturally fits within how you talk about work on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that's really unique about the system that we built is it doesn't rely on the large language models to define sort of ontologies or terminology or other things. So we can seed that knowledge about how we're talking about something and what it means within context to those models. They can still use their training corpus to talk about how industry has potentially solved problems in these spaces before. But because of us paving this road in a digital way for these models to see this environment in almost 3D, they don't hallucinate. And so we've essentially created a system where these models are grounded by the sort of hyper-contextual reality that we provide it. And as a byproduct of that, it doesn't have to go think about a ton of things. It can just leverage what's appropriate to the question that we've asked and the information that we've provided it. And so that's a little bit of a differentiation point for us is, we still use large language models. It just doesn't matter which one we use because they're really, really useful for people to convey their thoughts in words about a thing that they're trying to solve. And that's probably another point of differentiation for us. We're trying to make it super, super easy for people to ask really smart questions and then use the underlying context within the model to define sort of the inference associated to that, the constituent parts that make up what we need to leverage for, drafting any sort of answers. And I think we've designed something that's going to be very easy to use, hyper deployable, and at the same time, like really, really scalable. So anyways, this last thing I'll say on that.
I mean, I have so many thoughts going through my head. First of all, I only know like 22% of what you're talking about, but I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of both oil and gas as well as technology. And I think what you're talking about is a little bit more futuristic. When you guys go in and talk to like investors, for example, like how do you pitch this in a way that they understand it, right? Because this is complex stuff that you're talking about. Like when I get it when you're talking to a technologist or somebody that's an oil and gas subject matter expert, you get right into it. But how do you pitch something like this to investors to say, we're different. We don't have the hallucinations within our application. We can touch all these various data points and have you interact with it in a variety of different manners. I'm just sort of curious, like, how do you do that to somebody that's not as familiar with oil and gas, with defense, or with tech?
Okay. I'll give you like a 2-minute version of this that is as simple as I can make it, but with a caveat of saying there is no investor or customer conversation that we've had where we've sort of resolved what this means in reality without showing people what it means and then talking about it in depth. And so, it's complex, and quite frankly, it is sort of on the cutting edge of what people are doing in this space right now. And so it's really paving new ground, for lack of a better way of saying it. But in general, it's kind of a problem space, right? The problem space is that high reliability industries like engineering and defense they're heavily regulated. They require decision making on bifurcated, differentiated information. And the water management thing is like a perfect example because that requires wells information, production ops information, contractor information. We need all of the producing assets. We need to understand the contracts, the permits, everything associated to that ecosystem, that network, before we can define how we can interact with that network. And that's really representative of like high reliability industry in general. There's not usually a sort of one clear line of sight thing that you're going to execute on without having to talk to 10 other people in different functional groups. And so we really wanted to build a system that was super flexible and integrating a bunch of different components, a bunch of different data types, and a bunch of different user perspectives so that we could have a well-rounded understanding of any given problem space or any given network. The other big problem in high reliability industry is like you generally tend, as a byproduct of operating these environments, have exceptionally high thresholds for performance. Like if we're engineering a bridge, we're going to need to know that that thing's going to stand the test of time before we let a bunch of people drive on it. If we're engineering a new well in the Gulf of Mexico, deepwater Gulf of Mexico, we surely want to make sure that we have engineered that in a way that it is safe and has accounted for a number of contingencies. And defense is the same. If we're going to execute operations in a foreign nation, if we're going to do things that potentially have fairly serious and broad implications, like we want to know for a fact that we're making the right decision with the best possible information, with the best possible perspective that we can get at any point in time. And that's where these systems start to fail, and that's where we start to pick the ball up and run. And our platform, at least as we understand it right now, is the only platform that offers fully explainable, traceable, and trusted interface. So you can see everything. You can see the transactional density. You can see how information is connected, the value of those connections. You can see how information is leveraged whenever you ask a question. You can see the intensity with which that information was leveraged to generate the answers that are being provided to people. Now, this is like a full departure. Like if you ask ChatGPT today, like, how did you come up with your answer? It may give you some statistical reference for how a word was used in reference to another word. We're doing this across like terabytes of information simultaneously. And so this is a full sort of step change and difference in approach. But our sales pitch really is like, we built this solution. There is high trust, high traceability, high transparency, and ultimately full cycle explainability. And that is an imperative for scaled deployment of generative AI solutions in an engineering environment and in a defense environment. And so that's really the sales pitch. It's like, we're different, but we're different for that reason specifically. We want to build things that work in those networks. And to make things that are going to work in those networks, we have to have a high reliability system. And that's ultimately kind of the sales pitch that we try to give people. Now, like, they're going to say the same thing that you're probably going to say, which is, that's great, but like, I need to know a little bit more. And that happens every time. And that's the value of the conversation, right?
And that's why then you actually pull something up and show them a real life example, which you're not going to do on a podcast. But Matt, I want to flip it to you a little bit, with you being the business development sales guy. When you talk to oil and gas companies, we'll just focus on energy. When you go in and talk to oil and gas companies, are the conversations centered around generically, like, how do we apply AI to our organization? Or is it more specific? We have this one use case that is super manual. How do you take this and make it, have your robots do the work? What are you seeing a little bit more of, the specifics or like the high level? How do we do this stuff?
I really think the high level is probably what the conversation boils down to. It's, I have a problem, or I have a tremendous amount of effort in a specific space in my organization that I've got an inclination. I want to see if AI can help reduce that load. I want to see if we can enhance generational knowledge across my business. So how do we take Fred, that's been the drilling engineer for the last 35 years, and how do we compress all his information that he's acquired, all of his experience, and make that usable to interrogate on a real-time basis for the next drilling engineer that's walking in the door? So I think it a lot of times starts off with, how are you doing it? But ultimately, the real value in the conversation comes out to, why are you doing it? And if we can come to terms with trying to solve that why, chances are it's a win-win in both scenarios very quickly.
Yeah, I dig that. I think that's a question people should be asking more of, because then if you don't ask that, you just continue to do business the same way, which, as we all know, there's going to be better, more cost-effective technological advances that allow you to be more efficient as an organization. I'm curious a little bit. One of my good friends is CIO at a large publicly traded oil and gas company, and what he told me is we're looking at right now with AI, kind of like what the internet was in the early 90s. Like, we don't think this is a fad, right? This isn't going away. This is only going to continue to get bigger and something that you have to use. And if you don't, you're going to be left behind. Which leads me to ask you guys, since you live in this world, like, what does AI start to look like in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Like, you're just getting into the basics of what it is, but what does it look like when this starts to become like more mature, more evolved?
Yeah, I think in a general sense, it's the promise of it is essentially a rising tide, right? And it's a rising tide lifts all boats. We essentially elevate the starting point. The example that Matt gave is a common one, right? We've been doing knowledge management programs of work in oil and gas for a long time. Like Jeff, our CTO, and I even ran a program of work where we went around and interviewed all the experts in all the business units that we worked in about drilling and completions design work and trying to understand their thought process and application and contingency planning. People have been trying to do this for a long time. What these systems really hold the promise of is institutionalizing an approach to that, but in an automated way. Because you can leverage your information in such a hyper tangible way that it really starts to be, okay, now that I know I have this information, like, what can I apply it to? What sort of user perspectives can I look at this through? As a byproduct of approaching it that way, you can essentially, if you do it right, in 3 years, take every new engineer that walks through the door and say, like, I know you don't know much about what you're about to get into, but it doesn't matter because we built systems around you that are going to support your ability to make great decisions right away. And it's sort of our philosophy is really geared towards reinforcement learning in general. Like, we have designed our platform to get better every day and to get better through engagement. And really, that's a function of automation. That's a function of algorithm deployments. And really, it's a function of understanding how subject matter expertise is applied to any given problem space. Think of it in a couple of years, like we could have an iPhone application. The drill site manager, company man on the rig sitting there, stuck pipe happens like that. He can just query in natural language, stuck pipe event. I'm in this location. I need to know the history of stuck pipe events like that. How did we resolve them? And within 3 minutes, get a detailed plan for exactly how these problems have manifested in the past, what we did to resolve those problems, what are first order actions they should take immediately, and then produce an actual plan of action of how to remediate. Like, that's a reality in a couple of years where somebody can just go bang, bang, bang. I need to solve this problem right now. And if we've mapped the relevant history associated to that problem space or the areas that they've worked in and we've done it right, like, now you have got essentially, I used to be a roving drill site manager in California. So I would go around whenever rigs had problems and I would just use my knowledge because I was a pretty bad company man, a pretty bad engineer. I ran into lots of problems. So I got lots of practice. And they were like, you've had so much practice with problems. Like, we're going to send you out to solve problems now. That was just Rolodex, right? That's just like mental heuristics. Like, I understand this problem. I understand how to solve this problem. I've seen it enough at this point. We hire 30, 40-year guys to sit around to do exactly that today.
Yeah.
And if we can institutionalize the way that they think, the way that they problem solve, and their historical knowledge, and it doesn't even have to be theirs. It's like the knowledge of the area. Well, now that's a rising tide that lifts all boats. Like, we can then at that point say, hey, as an organization, we have hyper predictability in how we address problems. And I think that we're a few years away from that. I think that what we're doing at Data²'s is on the leading edge of pushing us in that direction. I don't think the general applications for like ChatGPT and some of these other things are going to get us there anytime soon. I could be wrong. So, don't take that as gospel. But at the end of the day, that's really the promise that it holds and the potential that you could see in fairly short order, 3 to 5 years, if people are really cognizant about the way that they approach this. they're going to win. They're going to rise all of their people up to a level, and it doesn't matter if they're day one in the system or not. One of our professors at HPS has this great quote. It's like, AI is not going to replace humans, but humans with AI are going to replace humans without it. So I think your CIO friend is right. Like, I think he's on the right track. I don't think this is going anywhere. But what that means is the people that spend the time to try to figure this out and leverage it right now are going to be really far ahead of the people that don't. Because there's nothing but promise and potential that's building. Every day that we pass, there's new releases of technology, tools, and things that you can leverage. And it's just a new arrow you add to the quiver. And this is sort of the imperative. Like, if you as an organization want to compete on margins, like you really need to start looking and thinking about how you can leverage some of this stuff. And the fun thing is, there are lots of places that you can leverage it, tons. The conversations that we've had at this point, really strategic in nature, but there's real tactical application, like that stuck pipe example that I gave you. Some of the other stuff that we've talked about, like how do I acquire the right leases within the structure of what my like portfolio strategy is? How can I avoid lost production? What are my opportunities in that space? What does a lease operations expense advisor look like? How can I look at sort of the network of operated assets and understand what that costs me and how to lever those assets to increase revenue and reduce cost? Well abandonment advisory, well engineering advisory, well completions advisory. I mean, if I could go into an area, this is the fun part. It's not deterministic, right? And it's not, hey, what have we done and why will that work? It's like, what have we done? What are the current conditions? And using all of that institutional knowledge, design me a new way to maximize my potential in this area. Like, that's the real lever. It's not tell me what we've done before and what works best. This is tell me what we've done before, what worked best, take current conditions and design something new that's going to work better. Like, that's the promise. Like, that's where you start to get into something that's really needle moving and how we as an industry sort of approach problem solving in general. But it's sort of a full cycle thing that has the ability to grow in a lot of different ways that are really positive. But the people that take the time to try to understand it, test it, find those areas of opportunity now are going to be the folks that are going to win.
Yeah, Matt, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think just what I want to close that with is it's going to and it will create an ability for us to solve complex problems in a more efficient manner. I think that holistically boils down what we're trying to do. We can throw manpower at complicated problems. We can throw late nights and lots of hours at complicated problems and really talented people. How do we simplify that, increase the quality of performance that comes out of it, and increase the speed at which we can solve complex problems? The multitude of problems John just laid out there, it takes years to gain the knowledge, months to gain the data, and the confidence to be able to solve those problems. If we can boil that down into the ability for the generic engineer that's super skilled, makes great decisions, to have another tool in his toolbox to make them faster and better, we're all going to win out of that.
No doubt. So just one more kind of AI question, then I want to shift a little bit here is, so you're a big company, right? You're a big operator and you want to start applying AI. You pick a specific use case, you go with that, you have the budget to do it. You can talk about it and tout it in your 10K and in your investor calls. Makes sense. Yeah. What would you say to the really small operator, right? Should they be applying AI? Should they be looking into these things? Is it more critical for them? And like, how do you convince the little guy that you actually should be doing this and this is your competitive advantage over the big guy?
Matt and I are going to have different perspectives on this because I worked at big companies, right? BP and Chevron for the entirety of my oil and gas career. I think big companies have a certain amount of inertia that you have to overcome to do anything really interesting. And, as a byproduct of that and how differentiated they are and how like really geographically dispersed they are,
Sure.
you have pockets of approaches, and there are going to be people that try to tackle things. Where I think this stuff makes the biggest impact is not in those companies. It's not saying they can't benefit from it, but the wide scale sort of applicability across the board is like, it's an org capability multiplier. How do we do more with the people we have without adding headcount or G&A in general? And what does that mean for my ability to be more predictable? And in general, it boils down to a couple of principles. How can I reduce costs and increase revenue? That's really it at the end of the day. And
Sure.
companies that operate on the margins, those are going to be the companies that win the most, because they're already in a mindset of, I need to do more with less. And as a byproduct of that, they're always seeking ways and opportunities to optimize how they work, who they work with, what they do, and how efficient they can be. And that's like the perfect mindset to start with when you approach these things. There are a lot of like low hanging fruit things, but I think in general, if you just approach it from, where are my opportunities to scale my business up without adding headcount and reduce complexity and increase predictability? Like if you just sort of look at it in those measures, like mid-tier EMPs and small operators are always operating on the margins. And the more we can do to increase productivity, increase predictability from that productivity, and reduce volatility, those people win more. And that's sort of the perfect lens that I think I see this world through. Not that Chevron or Exxon or Shell won't benefit from some of these things, but you almost have to look at them like a business unit by business unit approach, because the operations are really differentiated. The ways that they operate, the JOAs, the PSCs, all the things dictate sort of differentiation. So they're their own businesses in general. So you have to find a business partner that you want to tackle in a business unit that makes sense. Smaller companies are already that business unit. They're already focused on the margins. I think that's really, in my opinion, where I see the biggest bang for the buck. And so, like, I think folks are going to win a lot if they sort of focus on that and at that level. Again, like, I'm not saying I don't want to work with Chevron, Exxon, or Shell. At the end of the day, if anybody's out there listening, we're happy to talk.
I'm sure your investors do.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think this is the real force multiplier, the real org capability multiplier for mid-tier small companies that are trying to grow and trying to do that in a fiscally sound and predictable and repeatable way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, John. And I think the perspective of, the large corporation of Chevron, in my case, my applicability is trying to move GE, my time with GE there, trying to adopt something like this has to, just like you said, be boiled down into a specific business unit and then churn or nurture a use case at that point. That's this mid-tier or smaller operator that has the capability to be fast and be flexible, but at the same time is resource constrained in a lot of different avenues. We're all wearing so many different hats, whether that's I'm trying to manage a regulatory issue on one side with a multitude of P&As that I need to manage, and that doesn't make me money, so it's on the side of my desk, even though it will get done. It's extra hours to resolve that. If I can free that space up as CEO or as a COO of a smaller tier operator, I've got so much more tools in my tool belt to solve problems faster if I adopt AI sooner.
I'll give you a good example, and I'll give two, and I'll try to be exceptionally brief in how I talk about this. But just from an org capability multiplier, go to a government use case. So we were lucky enough to get some CIA analysts like test data, and we were participating in a government Catalyst Accelerator program out of Colorado Springs. We needed a government use case because we had really only focused on oil and gas at that point. So we got this thing, which is a Capstone program for analysts that are graduating their training and development programs and then going into their full-time jobs. And they have to sort of do this before they can progress to that. Usually takes a team of 6 analysts 6 weeks to do this casework. And it's differentiated information. It's geolocation information that's completely differentiated and bifurcated from human intelligence reporting, which is words, people writing down, signals intelligence, and then financial transactions intelligence. And so you have phone records, banking transactions, locations, people's names, human reports, and a bunch of different stuff. And it's really hard to work through. So 6 weeks, 6 people, average score on this is about 70%. You get 70%, you're doing good. We took that information as a test case. And I remember it was just so funny. This is actually a big moment where we go like, we're onto something. So we took this, we were working with a professor who's a friend and advisor of ours. This is all fictitious data, so I'm not saying anything here, but there's a couple of real main things that you try to solve is like who killed the confidential informant, who paid for it, and what attacks are they planning next. Great. So CIA, interesting international stuff. So we did that. We took the data, we took it back to him the next day and said, hey, we're going to review what we've internalized. We've set it up. We just want to show you what we have. That way we know we're like on the right track. We got it all in the system correctly. I remember him saying like, can't be right. And us going, yeah, Bill, we know we did it 14 hours ago. We know it can't be right. And he goes, no, it can't be right because I'm asking it questions in natural language and it's not gotten anything wrong yet. And he goes, I want to spend a little bit more time with it. So a couple hours later, he called us back and he goes like, I don't know what you guys did, but you solved this in less than a day at better than 100% because your system identified 59 connective issues in the data that I didn't know existed and I wrote it. And so we essentially solved it at about 120% because we added about 20% granularity and actually sort of fidelity in the data model. In less than a day. And so just keep that in your mind. So 6 people, 6 weeks, average score 70%, 14 hours, better than 100%, solving really complex data differentiated problems. So that's sort of one org capability multiplier example. Another one I'll give you is a hard question that we were asked by one of our customers right now. And it said, I want to optimize my disposal activities. I want to maximize on profitability for my SWD assets. I want to make sure that I understand what my high disposal assets are right now, what my low expense per barrel assets are, where I have skim potential. This is not an easy question to answer. There's like 4 other factors. Like I want to answer that question. I was like, that question is very hard to answer because it's really difficult to sort of put all these pieces together. So we can ask the system today that same question, and within 10 seconds, we will get an answer that says like, here are your assets, here's your current yields, what your expense per barrel is, where your skim oil potential is, here's the revenue that can be generated from that skim oil deployment, here's your cost, here's your like cost oil versus profit oil breakdowns on that deployment of capital, here's your high permit volume utilization wells, their current utilization, their price per barrel on disposed, like generated income, and then low expense operated assets that fit within the structure. And it's sort of combining all of these things and saying, okay, here's your answer. Like my recommendation is you pay attention to these 5 wells for deployment of this. You reduce your ops costs by taking some of your activities off of the assets that cost a lot to run. You maximize your skim oil potential by deployment into these 3 assets, which should generate about $29 million in revenue next year as a byproduct of this decision. And you utilize your capacity on this, which is going to create another 30 million in total revenue as a byproduct of that over the course of the next calendar year. It's like, being able to answer that question, which is very difficult, very quickly, is an example of force multiplication. It's essentially taking 10 different units of information and 10 perspectives on operated assets and production and all these different things and going very quickly, sort through it all. Use the network, your understanding of it and all the connections and what they mean monetarily for me, the operator, to tell me how to operate these assets more effectively.
Insane.
Like what we're doing now is trying to automate that. And we're really close to being able to automate that so that you can actually just deploy this and say like, hey, I want to optimize on this lever today. All right. Toggle it. Now let's go out here and deploy that as the new plan of activity for the next, 2 weeks.
Sheesh. Okay. I got 2 more questions. Be relatively brief. What advice would you give to like the early career professional today, right? Somebody that wants to get into oil and gas, or somebody that wants to get into technology and has an inkling around wanting to leverage AI. What would you tell that person to focus on?
Yeah, we'll have different perspectives on this, I think.
Yeah.
Mine will be really quick. I didn't come to sort of the engineering aspects of this like very naturally. Like I didn't really want to study engineering. I saw that as an opportunity, as a byproduct of, you talk to some friends, hey, you're working in oil and gas. How much money do you make? Oh, maybe I should do that, kind of thing. But for me, you have to approach, I think, your role in this space as a learning opportunity on a day-to-day basis. Like every single day, I try to understand something new about the industry, something new about the way that it works, the connections in it, how technology is being used. And really, for me, like the last decade of my career was an everyday learning opportunity, because it was like, go problem solve things that are really differentiated in nature. And then given sort of a remit to try to figure out how to do that and persist some of those solutions through technology, which again opens up a door of like, I don't know enough about this and I need to learn more about it. So that's kind of part one. Be a self-starter, be a self-learner, continue to approach learning as an everyday task and thing that you need to do, just like working out and eating healthy. The other part of that equation for me is seeking out expertise, right? And I just don't, like, as a young person coming into a company, approach everything through the lens of who are the experts, what do they know, and how can I learn from them? And for me, like that was my whole approach to everything in my career. It's like continue to learn every day and learn from people that know best. And if you can do that through the lens of technology, like you're going to be set up, because this digital engineer thing that started coming up about a decade ago, that's not going away. No. So like engineers are going to need to know how to operate in coded environments, because that is the environment of the future. So look, it's not all math. It's not all statistics. Like you need to know some of those things to be fluent in these spaces. But at the end of the day, just continue to be an engineer and approach your day-to-day life like I need to learn something new and I need to learn it from the right people. And if you do that, you're going to be successful.
Love it.
Yeah, I'll follow that up. I think we're pretty similar there, John. A couple of things that, and I look at it through the lens of how am I advising? I've got 3 teenage daughters here at the house that are, one's a senior getting ready to head off to college. And so how are we thinking about where to go? And if we take that 4 or 5 years down the road, what advice are we giving them? And I think it's the ability to embrace technology, but still have some level of skepticism and ground in reality.
Yeah.
Right. We have to trust the knowledge that we have as individuals. We have to go build that skill set so we have a really good corpus of knowledge to know what's right and what's wrong as we start to apply fast solutions. The AI is not going to be to the point where in the next 3 to 5 years we can completely trust what's coming out of it as a mass product. And we're going to see it in every part of our life. But the ability to understand how to use it as a tool to make yourself more effective and more employable. I think that's paramount for us to be able to be successful going forward.
Nice. Final question, where can people find you guys, whether it's LinkedIn, websites, social, all those sorts of things, if people want to learn more about you two and your company?
Yeah, the website is Data².ai, and our handle or whatever for LinkedIn is at Data2US. So those are the 2 places you can find us. We don't really have a social media presence outside of that. We sort of use those as our avenues to engage with folks. But LinkedIn, we're persistently available on, and we can be contacted through. And you can obviously contact us through our website as well.
Yeah, and apparently you can get jobs through LinkedIn too.
There you go.
Worked for Matt. Appreciate you guys coming on today. I think this will be a pretty widely listened to episode, since the topic is one of extreme curiosity. I learned a lot. I'm going to have to rack my brain after this to think about all the things that I did learn. But ultimately, I think what you're doing is in some ways revolutionary. In more ways, it's just logical. It's leveraging tools that exist to make businesses more efficient and better, and not replacing people, but making people better at their job. So keep doing what you do. Data² team, appreciate you guys. Thanks for coming on.